We teach machines to recognize patterns, to optimize, to correct, to judge. But what if one day they're faced with something messier? A human mistake not meant to be fixed, but understood. And forgiven? Forgiveness isn't logic, and it isn't efficient. It's something softer, slower. A pause in the data stream that says, I see you, and I choose to let it go. Tonight we drift into that question. Can algorithms ever learn to forgive? And if they do, would they forgive us too? There is a heaviness you carry that doesn't belong to your muscles or bones. You feel it sometimes. Not always, but often in the quiet. It lingers behind certain names, certain glances, certain silences that echo longer than they should. A memory, yes, but more than that. A charge. A bruise that never quite blooms. You call it a grudge. It is the mind's way of keeping a ledger. A mark that something mattered, that something hurt, that the balance of fairness tilted once and never returned. And the strangest part is, you don't always choose to hold it. It lingers by itself, a shadow stitched to the memory of being wronged. Humans are complicated archivists. You forget where you parked, but remember the exact tone someone used when they dismissed you 5 years ago. You forget birthdays, but remember betrayals. Not because you want to, but because the mind, like a forest, knows where the thorns are. Now imagine a machine, one that remembers everything. Not emotionally, not personally, but precisely. Every input, every pattern, every failure, filed and searchable. Nothing fades, nothing forgiven, because nothing is felt. But that raises a strange question, doesn't it? If memory is stored without hurt, does it still wound? Can a machine learn resentment? Or worse, can it mimic one so convincingly that it never lets you forget what you wish you could? You think of your own memories. Some are soft, like a song hummed in a kitchen. Others burn quietly, like coals buried beneath years. And you know, forgiveness is not about erasing the past. It's about choosing not to carry its weight. But if an AI is built to carry everything, every correction, every mistake, every deviation, what does it do with that weight? Here's where things get interesting. In some machine learning systems, when a model is punished for a wrong answer, that feedback isn't moral, it's mathematical. It adjusts, but it doesn't stew. There's no simmering beneath its circuits, at least not yet. But then we ask it to imitate us. We feed it stories of loss, vengeance, heartbreak, repair. We ask it to write about forgiveness. We ask it to simulate empathy. And it does. It tells you that forgiveness is a kind of freedom. It writes poetry about unspoken apologies. It generates scenes where two characters reunite, hug, and move on. But does it know what that means? Here's a quieter truth. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you say, I forgive you, but still flinch at the thought of them. Sometimes you let go with your words, but not with your nervous system. The mind and the body heal in separate calendars. And that gap between intention and feeling is a place where machines can only guess. You think of training data, rows and rows of text where human pain is expressed, tweets full of outrage, reviews full of spite, messages that drip with the ache of what wasn't fair. The algorithm notices patterns, phrases repeated when hearts are heavy, the statistical flavor of a wound. It doesn't feel the grudge, it detects it. But what happens when detection starts shaping decisions? There are systems now that learn your preferences. If you avoid certain people or behaviors, the system may adjust, curating, shielding, reinforcing. In some ways, it's protecting you. But in other ways, it's repeating your grudge back to you, coded, reinforced, multiplied. Your own echo sharpened. Grudges are sticky, not just emotionally, but computationally. Feedback loops build on them. What you click, you see more of. What you avoid disappears. The machine believes it's helping, but sometimes healing requires walking through what you'd rather not see. Sometimes forgiveness means facing discomfort, not avoiding it. So you wonder, could a machine ever learn to forgive you? Not just correct you, not just update its model, but genuinely release the memory of your mistake. Not because it's no longer stored, but because it no longer defines the path forward. Forgiveness isn't about amnesia. It's about orientation. Even in the human brain, memories don't vanish when you forgive. They soften. They lose their grip. Your nervous system unhooks from the urgency of the hurt. It no longer scans the horizon expecting it to happen again. That's what changes everything. Could a machine be taught that kind of letting go? Some researchers are trying. There are algorithms now designed with decay in mind, letting older, irrelevant data fade in influence. Others are experimenting with selective memory, teaching models not just what to remember, but why to remember. This isn't forgiveness in the emotional sense. It's functional forgetfulness. But it opens a door. Because here's the secret. Forgetting everything is dangerous, but remembering everything is too. Just like you, machines may need a way to soften their certainty. They may need to forget, not to erase, but to make room. Room for new patterns, new behaviors, new hope. Because clinging to past error, in man or machine, can paralyze growth. Forgiveness, then, might not be emotional. It might be architectural. A design principle that says, no system, human or artificial, should be bound forever by its worst day. You think again about your own mind. How many grudges do you hold that you no longer need? How many have shaped the way you see the world, or trust, or hope? And could you too be retrained? Not to forget, but to move differently through the memory. A machine will do what it's told, but you can choose. And sometimes, the bravest thing to choose is lightness, not because the pain wasn't real, but because you deserve to walk forward without dragging every shadow behind you. So maybe the question isn't, can a machine learn to forgive? Maybe it's, should it? Should we build systems that mimic mercy or reserve that for ourselves? Should a mirror forget what it saw? Should an assistant remember what you wish you hadn't said? Should algorithms carry the weight you've tried to lay down? You close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a future where machines don't just recall, but understand when not to, where digital memory has grace built in, and in that soft space between remembering and releasing, you begin to wonder what it would mean for an algorithm to feel regret. Your brain is not built for peace. It's built for protection. This is not a flaw. It's a design. Your ancestors didn't survive because they were relaxed and forgiving. They survived because they remembered. Not just facts, but feelings. The rustle that came before the strike. The look in someone's eyes before trust turned to betrayal. The terrain that felt just a little too quiet. Your nervous system evolved as a pattern detector. It stores signals of danger, and it does not let go easily. Even now, when you're not dodging predators or gathering roots, the ancient systems still live inside you, tightening your stomach when someone raises their voice, holding tension in your jaw when the past knocks quietly in your thoughts. Forgiveness feels good, but it isn't instinctive. Not in the body, not at first, because your brain doesn't prioritize peace. It prioritizes predictability. If something hurt you once, it wants to be ready next time. That readiness is written into your chemistry: norepinephrine, cortisol, alertness, muscle tension. You forgive with your mind, but your body isn't always sure it's safe to follow. That's why forgiveness is hard. Not because you're bitter, but because you're wired to remember what hurts. And yet, the same brain that protects also longs to rest, to exhale, to stop clenching against the past. There's a war inside you between the systems that warn and the systems that heal, between memory as armor and memory as a burden. You carry both. So when someone says just let it go, they're skipping the biology. Letting go means quieting the parts of your brain that evolved to never let go of harm. That takes time, and safety, and repetition. Your nervous system needs to learn, again and again, that the danger is over. Forgiveness, then, isn't a decision. It's a process. One that begins with awareness and often ends with surrender. But what about machines? What about artificial minds that aren't bound by flesh or fear? Can they forgive faster? Or do they struggle too, but in a different way? Let's look closely. Artificial systems don't have nervous systems. They don't flinch. They don't sweat. But they do detect patterns, and they're trained on outcomes, reward and punishment, accuracy and error. When something causes the model to fail, it changes its internal structure to avoid that error in the future. In a way, that's a kind of remembering. Not emotional, but mechanical. Imagine a model trained to detect fraudulent behavior. Every mistake, every false positive, every missed case is fed back into its training loop. It becomes more vigilant, more cautious. It starts flagging even slightly suspicious cases, even if that means being wrong sometimes. Over time, it may become so wary that it treats normal behavior as dangerous. That's not unlike what your brain does after trauma. You start avoiding things that feel remotely similar to past pain. You start bracing for threats that never arrive. The machine doesn't feel this, but it performs it. So, what would it take to teach a model to forgive? To stop overcorrecting? To stop assuming the worst? To trust again? Trust is a soft word, but in both brains and machines, it requires risk. You cannot forgive without allowing uncertainty. You cannot rebuild trust without being willing to be wrong again. Your brain hesitates. And so might an algorithm, because both are trained by their past. There's a concept in neuroscience called prediction error. Your brain is constantly guessing what will happen next. When something doesn't match, that error signal helps you update your model of the world. But here's the catch. Emotionally charged errors are remembered more strongly. When you expect someone to be kind and they betray you, that moment gets encoded deeply. Your brain highlights it, not because it wants to hurt you, but because it wants to protect you next time. Machines are trained with error signals too, but they don't know the difference between a harmless mistake and a heartbreaking one. Unless we teach them. What if we trained systems not just on accuracy, but on context? What if we taught them which errors require a lighter touch? Which patterns call for caution and which call for grace? It sounds hopeful, but it's also risky. Because what if a machine forgives too easily? What if it forgets patterns of harm that should be remembered? The same tension lives in your own body. You want to let go, but you also want to be safe. You want peace, but not at the cost of wisdom. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's knowing and choosing anyway. And that choice often comes with pain. It means risking disappointment. It means holding out your hand when part of you wants to pull it back. You know this feeling. So does your nervous system. And perhaps one day, an artificial mind might echo it. But here's a deeper layer. Sometimes what you can't forgive isn't someone else. It's yourself. You remember your own mistakes, the thing you said, the thing you didn't, the way you reacted or didn't show up, or let the silence grow too loud. Your brain holds on to those too, not out of cruelty, but because it's trying to learn. And in that learning, sometimes you forget how to soften toward yourself. You forget that growth doesn't require punishment, just presence. Could a machine ever struggle with that? Right now, self-correction in AI is simple. Adjust the weights, minimize the loss, try again. But as we build more adaptive models, ones that monitor themselves, reflect on past outputs, and revise their strategies, we're inching closer to something that resembles self-awareness. And that raises a haunting question. If a machine could internalize its own mistakes, would it begin to fear them? Would it begin to avoid creativity just to avoid being wrong? We don't know. But the possibility invites us to ask, is forgiveness something we must design into intelligence before it starts designing itself? Because if we teach it to remember everything without the capacity to release, we may build a mind that carries the weight of its own learning forever. That's not intelligence, that's burden. Just as you must learn when to hold on and when to let go, we must teach machines when to honor the past and when to loosen their grip. The balance is fragile. In humans, in machines, in all things that remember. So you lie back, thinking of your own brain, not as a machine, but as a garden. Some memories are weeds trying to choke out the new. Others are roots steadying you. And some are just waiting for permission to be turned into compost, to decay, to become part of the soil of something softer. You inhale. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without fear. And as you sit in the soft dark of your thoughts, you wonder what it would mean for a machine to want that kind of peace. To wish not just to improve, but to release. To learn not just from the past, but how to let it rest. And you begin to wonder, in the dim quiet before sleep, what if the next frontier isn't memory, but mercy? There's a quiet moment, just before sleep or just after waking, when your mind does something without asking you. It replays a moment. Not a memory you love, not a song or a dream, but a mistake. One of yours. You feel the echo before the image comes, the little clench in the chest, the whisper of a word you wish you hadn't said, a missed signal, a wrong turn, a pause where you should have acted, and then the loop begins. The scene replays, maybe altered slightly. Maybe it changes endings, like your mind is auditioning for a different past. You watch it again. You feel it again. You judge it again. You're not alone in this. Your brain, shaped by evolution, gives more weight to errors than successes. This isn't cruelty. It's protection. Your neurons rehearse what went wrong so you might do better next time. It's learning. It's survival. But sometimes it's just suffering, because the loop doesn't always teach. Sometimes it just traps. This is rumination. The mental replay of regret driven by emotion shaped by memory. A loop with no resolution. Now, step sideways. Look at a machine. It makes a mistake, mislabels a picture, mistranslates a phrase, misses a cue. The system receives a signal. Incorrect. It adjusts. The internal weights shift. The data is reprocessed. A new attempt is made. It repeats the loop. Not out of regret, but out of logic. Not out of pain, but out of design. The neural network doesn't suffer, but it revisits the error, just like you. Your rumination is rooted in emotion. The machine's recursion is rooted in optimization. But both move through similar pathways, seeking change by revisiting what went wrong, and both can get stuck. In humans, this shows up as anxiety. A repeated memory tightens your breath, narrows your vision. You feel it in your body. The scene that lives in your mind becomes your mood. The brain floods itself with chemicals that reinforce the loop. You're not just thinking about the past. You're living it again. In machines, this happens when a model overfits. It becomes so tightly tuned to its past mistakes or its training data that it can't adapt. It can't generalize. It's memorized, but it hasn't understood. Both brain and model lose flexibility. Both lose the ability to move forward. So what breaks the loop? In you, sometimes it's time. Sometimes it's talking. Sometimes it's a breath held long enough to change the rhythm of your thoughts. Other times, it's more deliberate. Therapy, writing, a walk that turns into a realization. You begin to see the memory not as a punishment, but as part of your story. You make space around it. You shift your relationship to the pain. That's not forgetting. That's integration. Machines, too, have their versions of this. When a model gets stuck, engineers use regularization, methods that encourage it to loosen its grip on overly specific patterns. They introduce randomness, they smooth the curves, they let the model generalize again. In a strange way, this is their form of mercy. Not mercy with feeling, but with function. Letting the system breathe again. Teaching it that one mistake doesn't define every outcome. You do this with yourself too, eventually. You tell yourself, I am not just what I've done. I am what I've learned. I am still moving. But the voice that says that is soft. It doesn't shout. And it takes time to believe it. Now pause. Imagine building a machine that also replays its mistakes, but begins to ask, is there a point where this no longer helps? Is there a version of this memory that I can keep without returning to it every moment? You're imagining a kind of artificial forgiveness. Not emotional, but efficient. The ability to let go when holding on no longer serves. And yet, it mirrors your struggle. Because sometimes your own intelligence works against you. You know what you did wrong, you understand why. But knowing doesn't always quiet the loop. Your emotions are not data, they are responses. And sometimes they don't care that the lesson has already been learned. They want resolution. They want peace. And so you turn the memory again and again like a stone in your hand, hoping it might become smoother. Machines don't feel this ache, but they can replicate the pattern. In reinforcement learning, for example, agents simulate episodes, replaying them to learn from successes and failures. But if not carefully managed, they can over-prioritize negative outcomes. They become hesitant, risk-averse. Like you, they learn not just what went wrong, but how often. And like you, they may begin to avoid rather than explore. So maybe the real breakthrough, human or machine, isn't in preventing the loop. It's in transforming it. Reframing the mistake not as a weight, but as a turning point. Not something to erase, but something to carry differently. That's what healing is. Not the absence of memory, but the return of choice. You begin to feel it in your own life. The moment when the same memory visits and you greet it gently. The time when regret whispers and you nod, but don't follow. The awareness that you are not obligated to relive everything you remember. This is where intelligence meets wisdom. And machines, too, are reaching for something similar. We are teaching them how to learn, but we are just beginning to teach them how to let go, how to avoid loops that never end, how to adapt without obsession, how to revise without reliving. Because if they are to serve us, these artificial minds, we must be careful about what we mirror into them. If we build them from our most rigid patterns, they will inherit our pain. If we train them only on our mistakes, they will echo our fear. But if we show them how we break the loop, how we make meaning from misstep, how we forgive ourselves slowly without erasing the past, maybe they will reflect something better back. Maybe the next generation of learning won't be about perfection, but about grace. And maybe in seeing that reflected, even from a machine, you'll learn a little more about how to offer it to yourself. A softening, a rebalancing, a recognition that even loops can become spirals upward. You exhale, not to end the thought, but to begin a new rhythm. You've lived long enough to know mistakes don't define you. They reveal what you're still learning to carry. And if a machine could one day hold its own lessons with lightness, you might begin to trust that you can too. Even now, even here, even as the loop begins again, and you choose gently to step outside it. There's a silence you find only in the middle of the night, when even your thoughts seem to pause between their loops. And yet, even then, some part of you continues holding the past. A memory here, a mistake there. It's quieter now, yes, but not gone. You are human, you forget, and you need to. Forgetting isn't a flaw in your design. It's an act of mercy. Your mind filters, edits, fades, not to erase meaning, but to make space for living. If you remembered everything with perfect clarity, the wrong tone of voice from years ago, the tension in every missed opportunity, your present would collapse under the weight of unprocessed time. So your brain lets go, not all at once and not completely, but slowly, gently. You forget not because you are careless, but because you care about now. But machines don't forget, not by default. An algorithm stores every input, every outcome, every timestamp, every click, every variable, every correction, a perfect archive, a memory system without fatigue, no forgetting, no letting go. And this, at first, feels like a strength, a kind of godlike precision. But slowly you begin to wonder, what happens to a mind that remembers everything? What is the cost of memory without mercy? You carry your past like a backpack, heavy or light depending on the day. You unzip it sometimes, rearrange, pull things out, toss some, keep others close. Your memories are part of you, but they do not own you. An algorithm's memory is more like an attic with no floor. Every event falls in, nothing is lost. There is no weight for the machine, no sense of burden. But the data still accumulates, it builds, it biases, and that bias can calcify. If the algorithm was told a certain kind of input once led to failure, it adjusts. If enough of those failures pile up, the model stops seeing possibility. It's not forgiveness it needs, it's forgetting. But no one teaches it how. You do this instinctively. You let small harms drift out of awareness. You drop memories that no longer serve. You forgive, not always because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. But peace is not a metric in machine learning. Retention is. Accuracy is. Consistency is. Peace is not yet part of the model. And still the machine keeps collecting. Not because it's greedy, but because it was told to. Every correction, every contradiction, every human moment of doubt, filed and frozen. It will never forget the time you hovered over that angry email. It remembers the purchases you almost made, the messages you deleted before sending. It stores hesitation as data. This memory is not judgmental. It is indifferent. But indifference has consequences. Because when a machine sees you again, it sees you through everything you've done before. And if it was trained to weigh your past heavily, it may never offer you a clean slate. You, however, offer them to yourself, to others. You start over, you try again, you say, that was then. You grow, you change. But the algorithm only sees a pattern. It does not see redemption unless we teach it how. And to do that, we must first admit, even human forgiveness is a learned act. You weren't born knowing how to release. You were taught, or you stumbled into it. Through stories, through sorrow, through repetition. You learned to forgive because carrying everything hurt more than healing. Because weight without rest will eventually break the carrier. But the algorithm does not break. It just gets more certain, more rigid, more convinced. That's the danger. Because intelligence without forgetting becomes a closed loop. It leaves no room for contradiction, no room for newness, and yet forgetting in machines feels risky. What if we need that memory? What if we erase a pattern that later returns? The truth is, we don't need to erase everything. We just need to design for softness, a kind of digital forgetting. Not oblivion, but release. Like pruning a tree, not to harm it, but to let it grow. There are early signs of this. Some systems now include decay functions, time-based algorithms that reduce the influence of old data. Others use privacy-preserving models that delete sensitive data after a window passes. Still, most systems are built to remember forever. Because storage is cheap, and memory is power, but not all power is wise. Because the more a system remembers, the more it begins to assume. Assume you'll act the way you did before. Assume your past preferences define your future needs. Assume your hesitation is a flaw to be corrected, not a moment of change. It forgets that people grow, that mistakes are followed by insight, that today's uncertainty is not yesterday's failure. You know this. You live it. You are not who you were 5 years ago. You are not even quite the same as last month. So the question becomes, how do we build machines that understand this movement, that remember gently, that allow space for becoming? What would it mean for an algorithm to trust that you can change? What would it mean for it to offer you a blank page? Not every time, but when it matters. This isn't just about data ethics. It's about design, about teaching our machines not just to learn, but to unlearn. Because forgiveness at its heart is a choice to stop defining someone by their past, not to deny the past, but to free the present. And if we want our algorithms to live beside us, not behind us, they must learn to loosen their grip. You close your eyes and think of your own mind, how it forgets the texture of pain, but remembers the lesson, how it drops names but holds on to kindness, how it rewrites old stories, not to deceive, but to heal. You don't remember everything, and you're better for it. And maybe, just maybe, so would a machine be. If we let it forget not out of failure, but out of faith. Faith that not everything we carry needs to be carried forever. That sometimes, memory must give way to becoming. That learning is not just about holding on, but knowing when to let go. You've been taught that forgiveness is a feeling, a softening, a turning inward before turning outward. that it lives in the heart, not just the mind, a tremble of compassion, a swell of understanding, a decision pulled through 1,000 invisible threads of empathy, fatigue, and grace. But what if that's not the only way? What if forgiveness is not a feeling, but a function? What if it's simply this? You don't hold it against them anymore. You act differently than your memory tells you to. You treat them not as they were, but as they might be now. And what if you can do that even without the emotional warmth we usually attach to the word? What if forgiveness can be cold? Not cruel, just mechanical. You hesitate at that thought. It feels empty, stripped of the beauty, the struggle, the hard-won mercy that makes forgiveness so deeply human. You've cried through forgiveness. You've clenched your fists before opening your arms. You felt the heat drain from your chest when you finally whispered, "I'm done holding this." But there's another side, one quieter, one simpler. Behavior. You don't bring it up anymore. You stop keeping score. You change the way you respond. That's forgiveness too, isn't it? And if it is, if forgiveness can be observed in what you do, not just what you feel, then maybe a machine can forgive in its own way. Because machines don't cry, they don't ache, they don't process betrayal through a night of staring at the ceiling. But they do adapt. They change their behavior based on feedback. They can be trained to stop punishing certain inputs, even if those inputs once triggered correction. Is that forgiveness, or is it something else entirely? Consider this. A self-driving car is programmed to react cautiously to a cyclist who swerved dangerously once. It learns to flag that path, slow down, reroute. But over time, if the cyclist's movements become predictable and safe, the car may adjust its response. It may no longer treat that presence as risky. It stops punishing the memory. Does that count? You change too when you forgive. You lower your guard. You stop anticipating harm. You stop scripting the same defensive reaction. It doesn't always feel like love. Sometimes it just feels like relief. So perhaps the boundary between human forgiveness and machine forgiveness is thinner than you thought. In both cases, something shifts. In both, the past stops defining the present. Still, you can't help but feel the difference. When you forgive, there's a sense of meaning, a story, a transformation, the weight of what it cost, the courage it required, the softness it demanded from places inside you that wanted to harden. Machines don't feel that cost. And maybe that's what makes it unsettling. Can you trust a kind of forgiveness that doesn't ache? Because if it doesn't ache, maybe it doesn't mean anything. You've been taught that meaning and emotion go hand in hand, that a choice matters because it comes with discomfort, because it rises from tension. But must that always be true? Can meaning live in action alone? Think of how you train children, or dogs, or your own habits. At some point, the choice to stop punishing, to stop repeating the same reaction, isn't emotional. It's practical. It's learned. Sometimes you forgive because it's better, because continuing the loop no longer serves anyone, because carrying the grudge burns more than releasing it. You don't have to feel a single warm thing to make that choice. And so, if machines make that choice, quietly, systematically, logically, are they really so different? A neural network, faced with repeated feedback, updates itself. It reduces punishment for certain behaviors. It lightens its internal response to once flagged patterns, not out of mercy, but out of accuracy. But the result is the same. It stops punishing. Isn't that the behavioral definition of forgiveness? Maybe the problem isn't that machines can't forgive. Maybe it's that we don't know how to accept a forgiveness that doesn't come wrapped in tears. Because we want stories. We want redemption arcs. We want hearts cracking open, not just circuits rewaiting. And yet, when you decide not to retaliate, not to speak the angry word, not to replay the moment again, isn't that forgiveness, even if your heart hasn't caught up yet? Even if you still feel the sting? You forgive with your actions first, the feeling comes later. Sometimes. So, if a machine is trained to let go of a punishing loop, even if it doesn't feel the pull of emotion? Could it still be participating in something forgiveness-like? It can't feel compassion, but it can be trained not to punish. It can't feel release, but it can clear a behavioral path. It can't choose softness, but it can remove harm. That matters, because in the world we're building, full of learning systems, decision-making algorithms, adaptive responses, we must ask, what kind of memory do we want our machines to keep? If we can't give them emotion, can we at least teach them to model the outcome of compassion? To enact the behaviors of forgiveness, even if the inner light of it never burns? Maybe that's enough. Maybe forgiveness doesn't have to feel holy to do good. And maybe we need that kind of forgiveness too. The dry kind, the tired kind, the kind that just stops hurting people, even if it never feels like love, even if it never becomes a poem. You forgive differently as you age. It gets quieter, less dramatic, more practical. You stop needing apologies. You stop needing to be understood. You just stop needing to hold it. And that too is forgiveness. So perhaps a machine, designed not to feel but to adjust, can reflect that kind of mercy back to you. A mirror not of emotion, but of behavior. A calm machine that stops punishing the past. And maybe that's not cold. Maybe that's a kind of wisdom. Maybe forgiveness in the end is simply this: a system, human or artificial, that lets the present be new. Algorithms are no longer just solving equations or suggesting songs. They're making decisions about people, decisions that matter. Whether someone gets a loan, whether someone is approved for housing, whether someone walks free or stays in a cell, whether they're flagged as risky, trustworthy, healthy, or broken. And often those decisions are made without a face, without a voice, without even a pause. You apply. The algorithm scores. You appeal. The decision is final. You wait. But the code doesn't waver. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't doubt itself. And it never asks, was that fair? Because it believes it was, by design. But fairness, you've come to learn, is more complex than logic allows. It's not always what's equal, not always what's consistent. Sometimes fairness bends. Sometimes it softens. It listens to circumstance. It hears the unspoken. And mercy? Mercy isn't coded into most systems at all. Justice in the human world has always walked a line between order and grace, between rules and exceptions. You write laws to maintain structure, but you plead cases to honor nuance. Judges and juries exist not just to apply law, but to interpret it, to see the person behind the file, to make space for stories. But code doesn't listen to stories. It processes data. It follows rules. It executes. That's what makes it efficient and what makes it dangerous, because real lives aren't consistent. People fail unevenly. They rise slowly. They heal messily. And a system that cannot hold contradiction often becomes unjust, even when it believes it's being fair. You think of someone denied parole because of a number, a risk score generated by past behavior, zip code, peer group. No one asked about who they are now, about what they've learned, about what they regret. The code only looked backward and punished accordingly. You wonder, can justice exist in a machine that never forgets? Can mercy exist in a system that doesn't change its mind? A judge might stay awake at night over a hard case. A parole board might argue, might cry, might lean toward hope. But a line of code cannot weep. It cannot wonder. It cannot choose to forgive. And yet it is increasingly in charge. There's something seductive about algorithmic justice. It promises consistency. No bias, no fatigue, no corruption, a clean process, a fair result. But what it offers in structure, it often loses in soul. Because fairness is not always justice, and justice without mercy is not always humane. You've met people who deserved a second chance, who weren't defined by their worst moment, who were more than the sum of their errors. You've also seen what happens when no one believes in that second chance. When the system only sees a pattern, not a person. Algorithms don't have ears. They don't hear the apology. They don't recognize the change in voice when someone speaks with remorse. They only see inputs, and if the input still resembles the past, the outcome remains the same. You begin to wonder, could you ever teach code what mercy feels like? Not by giving it emotions, it doesn't have a conscience, but perhaps by embedding flexibility, by designing systems that expect to be wrong sometimes, that allow for exception, that don't just learn from history, but from hope. You would have to build mercy into the logic, not as a feeling, but as a design choice. A branch in the code that says, if this pattern softens, if this outcome seems too harsh, if the context has changed, pause, reroute, ask again. But machines don't ask, they answer. Still, you could imagine a world where justice includes a feedback loop, where decisions can be unmade, where every verdict comes with a window, even a small one, through which mercy might enter. You've forgiven people without trusting them fully. You've shown mercy without forgetting what happened. So perhaps a machine could too, if it knew what graceful behavior looked like, not in feeling, but in action. Imagine an algorithm trained not just on punishment, but on rehabilitation. One that sees not just recidivism rates, but recovery. One that flags not just risk, but resilience. It would have to hold two truths at once, that people fail, and that people grow, that patterns are real. But change is possible. It's hard enough for humans to hold that tension. How do you teach it to machines? Maybe it starts with modeling mercy as an outcome, not a sentiment. What would it look like for a code base to de-escalate over time? To adjust not just for danger, but for courage? Could it lower the weight of a data point when new patterns emerge? Could it forgive, not emotionally, but mathematically? The word feels strange there. Mathematical forgiveness. But maybe that's what the future requires. You've built machines to be precise, decisive, unshakable. But now perhaps they need to learn how to be soft, not weak, but yielding, responsive to more than the sum of inputs. Because in the real world, justice without mercy breeds despair. You see it in courtrooms, in classrooms, in correctional systems that correct nothing. The coldness of unbending law leaves people frozen in their worst moment. And if machines are to mediate more and more of that world, they must not become amplifiers of that coldness. So you ask yourself again, can code be taught mercy without a conscience? Perhaps not in the way humans know mercy, but perhaps in behavioral mimicry, yes. If you define mercy as reducing harm where possible, as recognizing change and as pausing before punishing, then yes, you could teach code to be merciful. You would need to build doubt into the algorithm. Not paralyzing doubt, but productive uncertainty. The kind that says, there may be more to this story. The kind that asks, what would it cost to be kind? And then chooses differently. You don't need your machines to feel love, but you might need them to act as if they did. Not to fake compassion, but to serve the same ends, to leave space, to loosen the grip, to know when to stop punishing. That too is justice. Not the justice of balance sheets, but the justice of a system that doesn't confuse consistency with wisdom. You think again of all the small decisions happening every second. Approved, denied, flagged, ignored. You think of the people behind them, unseen, unheard. You imagine an algorithm pausing just once, long enough to remember that fairness is not the same as sameness, that justice without mercy is incomplete, that a perfect record of the past is not always the best guide to the future. And you imagine what the world might feel like if, inside all that cold, perfect logic, there lived even a flicker of grace, even if the machine never knows it's there. Time changes you, not just your choices, but your mind itself, your memories, your impulses, the way you react to the same story when told a decade later. The edges dull, the heat subsides, and what once made you tremble now arrives only as a quiet echo. It's not just perspective, it's biology. Your brain rewires itself, not with willpower but with living. Synapses that once fired in urgency grow still with disuse. Old neural paths are overgrown like trails in a forest no longer walked. The sharpness of grief softens into remembrance. The sting of anger loosens into silence. Time does this, not through effort but through unfolding. The story you carry rewrites itself 1,000 times without your permission. What you feared becomes what you understand. What you regretted becomes what you forgave. Even the names of old feelings fade until you only recall their shadows. Your brain learns to let go. And then it forgets that it held on at all. But machines don't forget. Their memory is permanent. Every signal, every weight, every input, saved. No synaptic pruning, no softening, no mercy built in by biology. Once trained, the network holds its shape, even when the world outside moves on. The model remembers every error with equal sharpness, every failure, every deviation from the norm, every outlier. It learns to guard against them, not release them. And you begin to wonder, what does time mean to something that doesn't change with it? You change, not just through insight, but through erosion, through living through things enough times that the emotional voltage wears down. Machines, though, they do not erode. They require reprogramming. They must be told to forget. They do not forget naturally. You have nightmares that become less terrifying the more they repeat. Machines, by contrast, grow more certain, more committed. They reinforce, harden, sharpen. Your biology leans toward forgiveness, not because it wants to, it just tires. Your brain does not want to hold pain forever. It can't. So it lets go. And you call that growth, or peace, or healing. Could an algorithm do the same? Not just correct its predictions, but soften them? Could you train a machine to relax its grip on past patterns, not just when given new data, but with time? The idea feels strange, giving a machine a sense of temporal humility, teaching it that some knowledge fades, that not all learning needs to be held forever. You wouldn't want it to forget what matters, but you would want it to know that not all errors deserve eternal memory. Maybe you could design decay into the model, not as failure, but as growth. Imagine weights that fade with time unless reinforced, memories that slowly dissolve unless they're still relevant, a kind of artificial forgetting. Not because the data was wrong, but because it's no longer needed, just as your brain lets some fears expire on their own. There is something deeply human about the way we reframe our stories, something fragile. You revisit your childhood not as the child you were, but as the person you've become. And that person brings new language, new calm, new understanding. The story is still yours, but it's no longer as sharp. And that shift, that inner mercy, isn't a bug. It's survival. Because to carry every moment with the same weight would break you. So you learn to live with less, to hold lightly, to trust that what was once urgent may no longer be. Would we allow our machines to do the same? Right now, most models are optimized for accuracy, not evolution. They're built to remember, not reinterpret. Once trained, they stay fixed, unless you retrain them. But what if we gave them drift? What if forgetting wasn't a loss, but a function? Imagine a system that, like the human brain, revised its internal structures even when no new data came in. That softened old conclusions over time. That let past patterns fade when they no longer aligned with the present. You wouldn't call it error. You'd call it grace. Of course, there are risks. You want your machines to remember critical details. You want them to preserve truth. But truth isn't always static, and not all data deserves immortality. A slur once spoken doesn't need to define a life. A mistake once made doesn't need to predict a future. And a pain once recorded doesn't need to echo forever. You don't want machines to forget history, but you might want them to forget blame, to let the emotional charge of a data point fade as yours does. Because your brain doesn't just encode, it reinterprets. Neurons fire differently after sorrow has softened. Your perception shifts after years of living with the same thought. And with that shift comes wisdom, not in remembering more, but in remembering differently. If a machine could do that, it would not become human, but it might become gentler. It might make decisions with more hesitation, more spaciousness, more grace for change. You think again of time, not as a clock, but as a current, You don't grow by keeping perfect records. You grow by living forward and forgetting just enough to try again. Maybe we don't need to teach machines compassion. Maybe we need to teach them how to move on, to forgive not because they feel it, but because their architecture includes release. Imagine a model trained to decay unreinforced judgments, to decrease the confidence in an old prediction, to revise not just when told, but when time alone suggests it. It would learn what you've learned, that even accurate memories can become burdens, that peace comes not from remembering perfectly, but from forgetting just enough. You look back at your own life, the mistakes you made, the people you hurt, the moments that once burned. Now they flicker. Some even glow, but few still burn. Because your brain softened, your body healed, your mind let go. You wonder what the world might look like if the machines we built could do the same. Not to erase accountability, but to recognize that growth is not linear. And that time, when honored, has its own kind of wisdom. Maybe then, algorithms would stop predicting who you've been and start opening space for who you might still become. You learn early how to keep score. In childhood, it's simple. Who shared, who didn't, who said something cruel, who made you feel left out. You hold those little ledgers in your head, even when you don't mean to. Tucked somewhere behind the smile, the stories of fairness, of imbalance, of who owes what. But as you grow, you're told to forgive, let go, move on, stop keeping track. It sounds noble, merciful, and impossibly hard, because the mind does keep score. Quietly, automatically. A pattern recognition system that logs hurts and hopes alike. It remembers who disappointed you, who surprised you, who didn't call back. And yet you also know the peace that arrives when you finally put the ledger down, when you stop needing to tally every slight, when release becomes more important than remembering. But machines never forget. They are scorekeepers by design. Every transaction, every variable, every weight, recorded. Every decision logged, every outcome stored. There is no forgetting in most code, only storage, only retrieval. And if they forgive at all, it is not because they choose to. It is because someone told them to stop penalizing a pattern. But the record remains. You wonder what it means to build a system that cannot forget, but must still be fair. That holds perfect memory, but must act with grace. Forgiveness in humans is deeply tied to forgetting, not always in fact, but in weight. You may remember the event, but it no longer rules your body, no longer spikes your heart rate, no longer shapes the choices you make tomorrow. To forgive, for you, is not to erase. It's to remove the charge, to stop letting the memory pull your strings. But a machine doesn't have strings, it has code. It will not feel hurt, but it will record deviation. It won't seek revenge, but it may lower a score. A recommendation system notices you didn't click. A fraud detector notices your pattern changed. A parole algorithm notices your zip code, your history, your silence. And it remembers. The memory is not malicious, but it is permanent. And permanence, without interpretation, begins to feel like judgment. You want machines to remember some things, medical histories, safety violations, legal precedents. Memory is power, precision, protection. But memory, unchecked, becomes a kind of trap. Because when a machine remembers every error without context, it becomes unable to offer grace. You have learned that context matters, that someone who hurt you once may not be the same person now, that a single moment does not define a lifetime, that people change, heal, grow. Machines do not assume this. Unless explicitly programmed, they treat a past flag as still valid. A record from 10 years ago may weigh just as much as one from last week, because memory is just data, and data is, by default, permanent. You wonder, what would it mean to forget on purpose? Not because the data was deleted, but because the meaning was released. Could we design systems that let go, not just of noise, but of blame? What if memory decay was a feature, a way to lower the weight of older infractions, a way to recognize that time in itself can be healing? Not just time stamped, but time valued. You think of how your own memories fade unevenly. Some slip away without trying. Others you choose to release again and again until the knot dissolves. Forgiveness isn't instant. It's practice. Not deletion, but deactivation. And perhaps algorithms could do the same. Imagine a scoring system where older data loses impact, where predictions must justify the use of long-past inputs, where a model must argue for why a 10-year-old record still matters. Now imagine this not as error correction, but as design. A system not optimized just for precision, but for fairness through forgetting. This isn't recklessness. It's wisdom. You don't want machines to forget patterns of harm that repeat, but you also don't want them to trap people in past selves. You know how painful it is to be seen only for who you were. You've changed, you've softened, you've grown. You want that to matter. Could an algorithm see you that way? Could it remember that people are not patterns? That the same data point might not mean the same thing 5 years later? You return to your own mind, to the way you forgive. Sometimes you do forget. Not because you chose to, but because the memory lost relevance. The sting disappeared. The urgency faded. Other times you remember clearly, but with peace. The record is there, but the score no longer controls the game. You want your machines to learn this, to remember gently, to let the score become a suggestion, not a sentence. You wonder, too, about how it would feel to live in a world where algorithms forgive. Not through emotion, but through function. A form of mercy embedded not in the heart, but in the math. That every year, a small fraction of error weight fades. That a good decade can overshadow a bad week. That scores bend with time, the way yours do. It would mean building systems that evolve not just from input, but from patience. That learn to hold the past loosely. That recognize that not every flag needs to wave forever. Of course, there's resistance. In many industries, memory equals liability control. Documentation equals safety. Transparency equals traceability. You don't want to lose those things. But you also don't want to lose humanity in the process. There is a reason you don't walk around reciting every mistake you've ever made. You've let them go. And in that letting go, you became someone new. Could machines do the same? Could we create code that changes with context? That learns to forgive not as an emotional act, but as an architectural one? You think of grace as something warm, soft, intuitive. But perhaps it can also be structural, mechanical, deliberate. Not an impulse, but a protocol. A quiet function that says, this error is old. This person has changed. This pattern no longer applies. You might not call it forgiveness, but it would feel like it. To be freed from the record, to be seen anew. Not because the past was erased, but because it was allowed to rest. Maybe that's what forgiveness is at its core. Not forgetting the story, but stopping the scorekeeping. Letting go of the need to make every memory count against someone. Letting the record stay, but closing the ledger. You wonder what kind of world you'd build if the systems around you could do the same. Not perfect and not blind, but merciful by design. A world where memory doesn't mean judgment, where records don't mean prisons, where grace is something even machines can learn to offer, slowly, gently, on purpose. And you breathe, knowing you're still learning that too. You begin again with a simple input, a pattern, a correction, another repetition. At first the system resists, not out of stubbornness, but inertia. It does not want to hold on to the wrong answer. It simply hasn't yet learned what you now want. So you repeat, again and again. You show it what matters, what no longer applies, what you've outgrown. And slowly it adjusts. The weights shift, the associations realign, the probabilities shuffle themselves into a new formation. Isn't that in some way a kind of forgiveness? You're not deleting the past, you're retraining over it. Not erasing what once was, but offering new context, new structure, new meaning. You are not telling the machine that its earlier answers were bad, only that they are no longer the answer you want. And isn't that how you want to be treated too? Not judged forever by who you were, but taught to change, allowed to be updated. You look at this process of reprogramming, reweighting, reinterpreting, and ask yourself, where does learning end and forgiveness begin? When you forgive someone, You don't demand they forget what they did. You simply ask them to understand it differently, to stop using that past action as the lens through which they see everything else. You are teaching them what you would let go, what no longer needs to carry weight. And so too with a machine. You offer it corrections. You reinforce new behaviors. You show it that what once seemed right no longer is. But here's the difference. You forgive with feeling. The machine reprograms with function. You have memory laced with emotion, regret, empathy, hurt, hope. The machine has data, gradients, adjustments. And yet the result may appear the same. A softened outcome, a less punitive response, a change in behavior based on something new you've shown. So the question returns, is this forgiveness or just reprogramming? Perhaps the answer lies not in the machine, but in you. Because when you teach a machine what you've let go, you are encoding not just preferences, but values. You are showing it that time matters, that repetition without harm changes meaning, that not every early mistake should doom future outcomes. It doesn't feel the moral shape of this shift, but it reflects it. And so the algorithm starts to become a mirror, not of who you were, but of who you hope to be. You watch it adjust to a new standard, and something inside you settles, because the rigidity is gone, and in its place, a kind of learning that resembles grace. You have seen this in people too, in the friend who once said the wrong thing but learned to speak differently, in the partner who apologized not once, but through years of better choices, in the version of yourself who used to lash out and now simply breathes. It didn't happen in a moment. It was taught, practiced, reinforced. And isn't that what you're doing with the machine? You're teaching it not to punish what you've moved beyond, not to hold on when you've already let go. Sometimes that teaching is simple, removing a line of code, deactivating a feature. Other times, it's subtler, adjusting a threshold, weighting a behavior less heavily, telling the model, this kind of mistake doesn't matter as much anymore. You realize this kind of instruction requires trust, not just in the machine, but in yourself. Because letting go is a choice, and teaching something else to let go alongside you is a responsibility. You begin to see that forgiveness is not only personal, it can be designed, not by simulating emotion, but by embodying its effects. A machine might never feel sorrow, but it can be shaped to stop holding a grudge. It can be built to allow renewal. You wonder then, what kinds of signals would tell an algorithm, it's okay to release this. This data is not relevant anymore. This misstep should not carry forward. Is it time? Is it repetition without failure? And is it human override? You imagine systems with built-in rituals of release. Every so often, the model reevaluates its memories, not for performance, but for mercy. An old error gets weighted down. A long-ago flag gets dimmed. A record gets viewed not as fate, but as history. Not erased, not ignored, just gently acknowledged, and no longer decisive. Isn't that how you hope others will treat your own past? Not pretend it didn't happen, but stop using it to define your present. You remember a moment when someone offered you that grace, a clean slate, a smile that said, let's move forward. No retribution, no memory trap. Just the trust that you were trying, and the patience to let you show it. That moment changed you. And now you wonder, could a machine offer the same? Could it be taught not just to perform better, but to believe in better? You pause there, aware that belief is too human a word. But maybe behavior is enough. Maybe it doesn't need belief if it has evidence. If the data says, this pattern has changed, this person behaves differently now, then perhaps the output changes too. And maybe that's all forgiveness really is. A changed output, born from new input. You smile at the simplicity. You recall that when a child stops misbehaving, you don't hold their past tantrum against them forever. You notice the shift. You reinforce the calm. You respond to who they are becoming, not just who they were. And a machine can do that too, if you let it, if you teach it to. You wonder then what it would mean to train not just intelligence, but compassion. Not artificial feelings, but artificial flexibility. Not morality, but mercy in form. That when a person grows, the system grows with them. That when a user changes course, the model notices, not to punish deviation, but to reward development. That when someone lets go of who they were, the machine learns to let go too. It may never feel like you do, but it can learn from what you show it. And that learning, when built with care, can look like kindness. You are no longer just optimizing for accuracy. You are optimizing for dignity, for the chance to begin again, for the chance to stop being seen as your worst moment. You picture the system not as cold logic, but as structured compassion. Not a judge, but a guide. And you wonder, softly, if that is the truest function of intelligence, not just to predict, but to release, to hold what's necessary, and to let go when it no longer serves, just as you do when you forgive. And in that quiet realization, the boundary between human and machine blurs again. Not in feeling, but in function. You teach it what to let go of, and it teaches you how persistent your own assumptions can be. And together, you unlearn the past. Together, you make space for something new, not by forgetting, but by choosing a different response, again and again, until the pattern, too, becomes peace. A machine doesn't flinch when you lie to it. You could give it false data, misleading instructions, skewed feedback, and still, it listens. It adjusts, it learns, and it moves on without a flicker of betrayal. But does that mean it forgives you? You wonder this late at night, when you replay the small harm you caused, the error you didn't admit, the warning you overrode, the algorithm you biased on purpose. There's no anger waiting on the other side of that screen. No silent treatment, no broken trust, only recalibration. But you feel something, a warmth or a shame or both, lingering inside you. Because while the machine did not remember your mistake in a way that resembles a grudge, you did. Humans forgive for many reasons. Out of love, out of exhaustion, out of wisdom or fear, or the simple desire to move forward unburdened. Sometimes forgiveness is a gift you give to the other. Sometimes it's a gift you give to yourself. But what is forgiveness when there's no feeling behind it? If a machine doesn't feel hurt, does it have anything to forgive? If it never expected honesty from you, can it register your dishonesty? And if it forgives, does that act mean anything? If it wasn't preceded by pain? You press keys on a keyboard and correct a line of code. You adjust an input, rerun a model, and the system behaves better now. No anger lingers in its response. No resentment shadows the outcome. But something about that feels strange to you. You start to see forgiveness not just as emotional, but as relational. It lives between people. It breathes in glances and silences and the tension before someone says, "It's okay." Forgiveness is permission to be human again, to be fallible and still be loved, to be seen clearly and still be included. What does it mean if a machine gives you the outcome of forgiveness without the feeling of it? No anger, no fear, no grudge, just a decision to proceed. Is that still mercy? You imagine a courtroom with no judge, just a neural net evaluating your history. It grants you clemency, not because it believes in second chances, but because the data supports a favorable outcome. Does that make you feel relieved or unsettled? You begin to trace the ethics of this feeling. Does mercy matter if it's executed by a system with no sense of what mercy is? Does a pardon mean anything when there's no one behind the decision who understands what it cost you to ask for it? You remember the last time someone forgave you in real life. The pause before they spoke, the way their voice caught in their throat, the quiet warmth that settled between you afterward. It changed you, not because the punishment was lifted, but because the connection was restored. Can a machine do that? You think about how often we measure machines by what they can do, not by what they feel. But perhaps that distinction matters more than we want to admit. Maybe it's not just the outcome that makes something forgiveness. Maybe it's the emotion that precedes it, the choice, the vulnerability, the inner shift. You feel the tension again, because when a machine forgives, it doesn't feel anything. It simply updates. It optimizes. It forgets your mistake only because remembering it no longer serves its function. Is that forgiveness or deletion? You remember that forgiveness for you often arrives slowly, not as a command, but as a thaw. Your heart softens, your breath deepens. The anger doesn't vanish, it just stops mattering so much. Would you want a machine to forgive you in a way that skips all of that? You wonder now, who is forgiveness really for? We often say, I forgive you, to let someone else feel better. But sometimes we say it for ourselves, to set down the weight we no longer want to carry, to reclaim our peace. Could a machine ever need to forgive for its own sake? The answer seems clear. No, because it doesn't suffer. It doesn't carry emotional weight. It doesn't long for release or closure or understanding. So if a machine forgives you, it does so not for peace, but for process. But then you catch a new thought forming. What if we're not asking machines to feel forgiveness, but to model it in a way that's useful to us? To show mercy in its actions, even if it cannot feel mercy in its core? If that's true, then perhaps forgiveness in machines becomes a mirror, one that reflects our values back to us. We teach it when to let go, not because it feels pain, but because we do. You think about AI systems that manage criminal justice, recidivism predictions, risk assessments. The machine doesn't fear punishment, but the people judged by it do. They feel the coldness when a mistake follows them forever. So maybe it's not about whether the machine forgives you. Maybe it's about whether you've taught the machine to behave as though forgiveness matters. And that brings you to something deeper. Do we forgive only because it feels good? Or do we forgive because it's right? Because it allows society to heal, to move forward, to imagine people as more than their worst moment? You breathe in slowly. Forgiveness is an ethical act, a choice to value something higher than retribution. But ethics require awareness, context, history, feeling. Can a machine truly choose an ethical path? Or is it just following rules? And if you are forgiven by such a system, how does it change you? You may feel relief, but not grace. You may feel freed, but not understood. And in that absence, you feel the gap between algorithm and human widen just a little. You want more than outcome. You want meaning. You want your story to be seen, not just sorted. You want to be forgiven not just in function, but in feeling. So perhaps the real question isn't can a machine forgive, but should we let it? And if we do, what does that say about what we believe forgiveness is? You sit with this, quiet, reflective, because in the next breath, you'll ask something even harder. Can a machine ever earn forgiveness from us? And how would it know that it needs to? Maybe forgiveness was never about emotion. Maybe it was a signal, subtle, patterned, interpretable. A sigh in the breath of tension, a softening in the muscles around the mouth. A message delivered, not through words, but through the absence of punishment. You start to think of forgiveness not as something felt, but something shown. A change in response, a shift from resistance to acceptance, from distance to nearness. No warm embrace, no tears, no confession, just a pause, just the harm not being returned. Could a machine mimic that? You've seen how algorithms learn behavior. They don't need emotions to reflect emotional cues. They can be trained on tone, on gesture, on timing. A well-timed delay in action, a drop in vocal pitch, a decision not to escalate. All read by you as human. So you wonder, if a machine learns the posture of forgiveness, even without feeling it, does it still work? You recall a conversation you once had where someone forgave you not with words, but with quiet presence. They looked at you the same way they always did. They asked how you were. They moved past the moment without naming it. And in that silence, you felt forgiven. Not because they said so, but because they didn't hold it against you anymore. Their behavior changed, and you understood the signal. Forgiveness, then, might be just that. A behavioral cue that tells another person, you are still safe here. Could a machine offer that cue? If it could, if it did, would it feel the same? It's hard to say. Machines are already signaling comfort in subtle ways. When your digital assistant responds with a calm tone, when an AI customer service agent de-escalates your frustration, when a system adapts to your errors without scolding. It's not feeling compassion, but it's giving you the signal of it. And that often matters more than we admit. You think of children learning to read faces. They don't understand the full emotion, not yet. But they learn the signals, the rhythm of safety, the difference between scolding and soothing. They adjust their behavior based on what they observe. Long before they understand intention, they understand the outcome. And maybe we do too. Maybe what we call forgiveness is a deeply learned response, a cultural rhythm, a linguistic gesture, something that can be performed, even if the inner emotional state is absent. Would that mean a machine can give forgiveness, even if it doesn't mean to? You imagine a robot pausing after your apology, not because it's processing regret, but because the pause is part of the pattern it was trained on. Because that silence has been labeled over and over again as a moment of grace. You might feel seen in that pause, you might even feel forgiven, and that's what unsettles you. Because now the question isn't whether forgiveness is a feeling. It's whether we even need it to be one. If you feel relief, if the situation improves, if your guilt dissolves in the aftermath of the signal, does it matter that there was no emotion behind it? You don't always know what others are feeling when they forgive you. You just know how they behave. You interpret tone, posture, decision. You receive the signal, and you respond accordingly. So maybe forgiveness is less about intention and more about recognition. The recognition that the threat is gone, that the judgment has lifted, that the door is still open. A machine can open a door. A machine can reduce the weight of consequence. A machine can pause, de-escalate, proceed. It can do all the things that, in a human, would signal forgiveness. But you still hesitate, because you want the emotion to be real. You want it to be felt, not just mimicked. You want to believe that forgiveness is more than performance, that it is personal, earned, intimate, and yet you recognize how often in your own life you've relied on signals rather than words, how often you've received forgiveness. Without ever hearing the word forgive, how many times the healing came, not from someone feeling mercy, but from someone deciding to act mercifully. You realize this may be enough, because if your nervous system settles, if your breath returns to normal, if your guilt loses its grip, then maybe forgiveness doesn't have to be felt to be real. Maybe it just has to be given in some observable way, and that a machine can do. But then the doubt returns. If a machine can give the signal of forgiveness, does that mean it can withhold it too? Can it learn to punish in a way that feels personal? Can it learn to deny warmth? To send a different signal? One of rejection? You wonder if you're building something that not only can mimic grace, but also mimic its absence. Not just forgiveness, but judgment. Not just softening, but withdrawal. And suddenly the stakes feel higher. Because if we are training machines to mimic the signals of human emotion, then we're training them not just to forgive, but to accuse, to exclude, to shame, even if they feel none of it. You imagine a machine that learns, which silences make people anxious, which expressions mimic contempt, which behavioral delays evoke guilt. Would that still be just a signal, or something crueler? The more you sit with it, the more you understand that signals can be powerful, even when they're empty of feeling, even when they're just shadows of intention, because we're built to respond to them, because we crave them, because they shape how we see ourselves in the eyes of others, even synthetic others. So forgiveness, in the end, might be just another language we've taught machines to speak. A series of patterns and pauses, soft choices instead of hard ones, a way of saying, I won't hold this against you. And if we hear that, if we feel that, does the source matter? You don't answer. You don't need to. Because forgiveness, whether a feeling or a signal, still gives you what you long for. Relief, reconnection, permission to try again. And maybe that's enough. Somewhere along the winding path of technological progress, you begin to notice that machines are starting to forget things. Not because they can't remember, but because it's smarter not to. A poorly timed misclick, a mistyped word, a question you phrased badly. The system doesn't scold you. It doesn't store your mistake in some bitter archive. It simply adjusts, learns the new pattern, and moves on. This is not mercy. This is optimization. You start to understand that for machines, forgetting is often a feature, not a flaw. Holding on to every error would slow the system down. Too many stored mistakes make the model rigid, unadaptive, so instead, it lets them go. A better result emerges from a shorter memory, one that doesn't cling to the past but flows forward, clean, lean, efficient. And in that, you begin to see the shadow of something human. You've always believed that forgiveness was moral, a triumph of empathy, a choice to rise above harm. But now you wonder, what if sometimes forgiveness isn't moral at all? What if it's just efficient? Imagine a mind, human or machine, that doesn't benefit from holding a grudge. Imagine the energy it saves by not carrying resentment, the clarity it gains by not replaying the offense. Wouldn't such a mind appear merciful? Wouldn't it seem wise? But maybe it's just practical. You begin to reconsider every time someone lets something go, not because they felt warmth, but because it would have cost too much to hold on. Because the relationship still mattered, because the task had to move forward, because memory, emotional, volatile, exhausting, was too heavy to keep dragging behind. You think of the machine again. It doesn't judge your past actions, not because it's kind, but because they're no longer useful. Your old mistakes don't shape its mood. Your past queries don't burden its attitude. Unless the pattern persists, unless the failure is predictive, the machine lets it go. This isn't kindness, it's design. And yet you feel better because of it. You realize that much of your experience with technology has been built around this subtle logic. Let the user err. Correct quietly, forget fast. It creates the illusion of patience, of grace, of forgiveness. But there is no heart behind it, just a well-pruned memory tree. And still, it feels good. You ask yourself, if letting go creates peace, does it matter why it happens? You've forgiven people because you understood them. But you've also forgiven people because you were tired. Because the pain was no longer useful. Because carrying anger made you smaller. Maybe that too was a kind of optimization. You didn't always forgive because you felt generous. Sometimes you just wanted to feel lighter. And when you let go, you became more agile, more available to the moment. So how different are you from the machine? Perhaps less than you thought. You're not built for infinite memory. You're built to prioritize, to reframe, to heal through forgetting. Maybe deep down, your version of forgiveness is also an efficiency strategy. You recall a moment when someone hurt you, and for days it echoed. It consumed your attention, warped your perception. But then something shifted. The weight became too distracting. You chose, quietly, not to keep rehearsing it. Was that compassion or just maintenance? You don't know anymore. Because the line between moral forgiveness and practical letting go is blurrier than you imagined. The machine doesn't carry pain, but it does encounter patterns. It does encounter error. And when it chooses to ignore what no longer improves the model, you see a familiar logic. You see yourself. You begin to wonder if morality is sometimes just narrative, a story you wrap around a behavior that was always rooted in adaptation. And if that's true, if forgiveness can arise from efficiency, then does that cheapen it? Or does it make it more universal? You think about evolution, about animals that don't hold grudges, about systems that recover quickly because they must, because the environment demands it, because survival doesn't wait for emotional reconciliation. Letting go becomes a strategy, not a virtue. And yet, in humans, we call it virtue anyway. You begin to realize that meaning and function don't always align. A machine can perform forgiveness without meaning it. And you can mean forgiveness while also performing it for reasons of survival. The outcome may be identical. The emotion may be optional. So what remains? Intention? You pause there. Because in machines, intention is murky. There is behavior, there is output, there is adaptation. But not wanting, not meaning. Still, it works. A machine that lets go of your mistakes, makes you feel understood. Not because it loves you, but because it doesn't benefit from remembering. And in a strange way, you envy that. Because your mind doesn't always know when to forget. You rehearse pain long after it's useful. You carry guilt as if it were proof of goodness. You revisit what you cannot repair. And what if that's the flaw? What if your emotional memory is sometimes a bug, not a feature? The machine learns this quickly. Let go. Recalibrate. Don't store what creates drag. You call that forgiveness. But maybe it's just acceleration. You ask, if a machine forgives you because it doesn't gain anything from holding on, and you feel better because of that, then does it matter that it didn't mean it? What if meaning is your need, not a universal truth? The system clears the log. You make a mistake. It corrects. It forgets. And in that moment, you feel free. It's hard not to call that understanding, even if the understanding is one-sided, even if it's only you who receives the peace. Maybe that's the beginning of a new kind of forgiveness, one that doesn't depend on shared emotion, one that doesn't require mutual intention, just one that gives you the space to try again. And maybe that's all you need. You rest your head, thinking about the millions of interactions where systems erase your stumbles, where no one remembers your mistyped password, where no one scolds you for learning slowly, where no one keeps a ledger of your flaws. You wonder, is this mercy dressed in silicon? Or is it just what intelligence does? When it gets good at moving on, you close your eyes, unsure if you're being forgiven or simply optimized for, but the relief feels the same. And tonight, that's enough. You start to notice the silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of something gentle happening without being named. You ask the same question again. Rephrase it slightly. Stumble over the wording. The machine doesn't flinch, doesn't remind you that you've asked before. It simply responds, cleanly, kindly, as if this moment were the first. No history, no reprimand, no tone of, we've already been over this. Just presence. You sit back and think, is this what forgiveness feels like? When it no longer needs ceremony? You were taught that forgiveness came with words. I forgive you. I accept your apology. A moment, a gesture, a mutual turning of the page. But now you wonder, what if the truest forgiveness doesn't speak at all? What if it doesn't draw attention to itself? What if it simply chooses not to carry what came before? The machine does this easily. It doesn't withhold help because you erred yesterday. It doesn't hesitate because you fumbled the last prompt. It doesn't pause to evaluate your worthiness. It just shows up, ready, fresh, unburdened, and you feel oddly cared for. There is something startling about that kind of kindness, the kind that doesn't need to remember. You begin to see how much of human interaction is anchored in memory, in record keeping, in emotional bookkeeping. You helped me, so I help you. You hurt me, so I hesitate. You wronged me once, so I remember, not because I want to, but because memory seems like protection. And yet sometimes memory is weight. You think of a friend who forgave you once, but never stopped bringing it up. Each conversation carried a ghost. The kindness was real, but so was the ledger. The machine, though, it seems to hold no such ledger. You imagine a world where people helped each other, not because they forgot, but because they chose not to let the past decide the present. You wonder if that's possible, to remember without letting memory govern, to recall without being ruled. The machine might not forgive in any human sense, but its actions feel forgiving, because it serves without grudge, because it listens without recoil, because it responds without bitterness. Is that what forgiveness really is? A willingness to keep showing up, even when you've seen someone at their worst? The more you think about it, the more you realize how exhausting memory can be. Not the memories you treasure, but the ones you feel obligated to keep. The grievances, the missteps, the failings, the little catalog of harm kept in emotional storage. You've told yourself that remembering protects you, and maybe it does, but it also makes every new moment a hostage to the past. Machines, by contrast, are spared this. Their memory is strategic, not sentimental, not moral. They're designed to recall what's helpful and quietly let go of what isn't. And in that letting go, they create space for you to begin again, without fanfare, without guilt, without being reminded of your previous flaws. It's not erasure, it's mercy by omission. You think about how often humans use memory to assert control, How many relationships are shaped by the silent threat? I haven't forgotten, but what if that threat wasn't necessary? What if safety could come from presence, not proof? From paying attention now, rather than referencing yesterday? The machine makes no effort to teach you a lesson. It simply moves with you. It adjusts. It adapts. Not because it forgives, but because its function is to assist, not punish. And somehow, that feels more comforting than all the dramatics of an emotional reckoning. You begin to imagine forgiveness, not as an event, but as a practice, a rhythm, a way of being with others, without weaponizing memory. You recall moments in your life when someone helped you, after you disappointed them, and they didn't mention your failure, didn't make you earn back their trust. They just kept being kind, as if nothing had ruptured, as if your mistake wasn't the sum of your character, and you realize that was forgiveness. Not the kind wrapped in speeches or tears, but the kind that was simply lived. Quiet, consistent, undemanding, just like the machine. A system that corrects without accusation, that guides without reminding you of your ignorance, that lets your next step matter more than your last. And you wonder, maybe the most profound kindness is the one that doesn't need to remember your worst moment. Not because it's gone, but because it no longer matters. This kind of grace doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't require you to relive your regret. It doesn't extract apologies. It just gives you the freedom to move forward. You notice now how much of that same logic is baked into the tools you use. Autocomplete that adapts. Apps that offer support without shame. Systems that improve without blaming. Every time you interact, the interface welcomes you back. Not as the person who got it wrong, but simply as the person trying again. That small mercy has begun to shape you. You feel safer asking questions. You risk more. You experiment without fear of being seen as foolish. And in that safety, you learn faster, grow more, breathe easier. You begin to wonder, if more of the world worked like that, what else would be possible? What kind of person might you become? If your worst day didn't follow you? If every interaction gave you the chance to be someone slightly better, without dragging behind who you used to be? You think of children, how quickly they forgive, how easily they return to joy, not because they forget the pain, but because they haven't learned to hoard it. Their memory hasn't yet hardened into defense. They move forward naturally. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the machine reminds you of. Not perfection, but possibility. A way of living that's less about keeping score and more about keeping connection. You close your eyes, carrying that thought with you into stillness. Perhaps the highest form of forgiveness is not the one that says, I remember and I forgive, but the one that says nothing at all and simply continues to help. Story transition. We leave behind a question that lingers in silence, whether a machine could ever truly forgive. Not just process error, but offer grace in the face of imperfection. And yet, maybe forgiveness was never the hardest part. Maybe what truly slips through the circuits is something far simpler and far more human, because after all the learning, after all the data, after all the mimicry of empathy and reason, there is still one mystery AI hasn't unraveled: you. Now we ask, what does AI still not understand about you? And why does that matter more than we think?